Bueno, llegó el momento esperado, el momento anhelado y por el cual hicimos esta reprogramación con la receptividad de ustedes, y es que hoy tenemos un invitado internacional, una persona de amplia trayectoria que ha aceptado compartir con nosotros su experiencia para contarnos cómo puede ser cómo se puede concretar esta idea de trabajar alrededor del desarrollo de las habilidades socioemocionales, pero también medir, ¿sí? Que es un compromiso que tenemos, porque en este marco que tenemos actualmente en Colombia estamos transitando de las habilidades socioemocionales a las competencias socioemocionales. Entonces le damos la bienvenida a Tom. Gracias por aceptar de manera generosa compartir con nosotros tu experiencia y gracias por compartir hoy en este espacio y aceptar la reprogramación que tuvimos que hacer por la herramienta de traducción. Muchas gracias, Tom. Adelante.
Thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. And thank you very much for hosting me. And I'm really excited to share a little bit of the work that we've been doing at Skills Builder and addressing part of what you were talking about already, and thinking about how do we help to capture and codify essential skills and social emotional learning for the benefit of educators and, of course, young people themselves. So I'm just going to share my slides now. Share. Here we are, perfect. Hopefully everyone can see that well. Um, so to introduce Skills Builder, um, what I'd like to do over the course of the next few minutes is firstly just to frame up what is Skills Builder Partnership and what's the challenge that we're addressing. To introduce you to the Universal Framework, which is our open source tool for assessing and building essential skills, exploring some ideas of how partners are already putting it into practice around the world. And then finally, I'm really keen to have lots of space for your questions, for ideas, for discussion as well. So the challenge that we focus on at Skills Builder uh, is how do we ensure that as a normal part of a good education, every child and every young person is building the essential transferable skills to set them up for success. And we think about 8 skills when we ask this question. So we're thinking about listening and speaking, about creativity and problem solving, about leadership and teamwork, and about planning and adapting. And my work on this started back in 2008 when I was myself a teacher. And I was teaching 14 to 19-year-old students. And I was finding that we had nowhere near enough clarity about exactly what we meant when we came to building these skills. And that felt like a huge challenge. And of course, that's a problem which is only growing across the world. And I think children and young people in classrooms today face growing challenges in their futures. They're dealing with accelerating technological change. There are emerging threats, whether that's conflict or whether that's climate change. These are very real things that are having effects for children and young people already, and will likely have even bigger effects in the future. We know that there are some really long-standing inequalities when it comes to being able to access employment and higher education beyond school as well. And so the question that we ask ourselves at Skills Builder Partnership, and I'm sure is one that every AFSEC member is thinking about all the time, is how do we ensure that all children and young people get an education that sets them up to be able to thrive? For us, that complete education has to include the development of these essential transferable skills. And as I mentioned already, listening and speaking, problem solving, creativity, adapting and planning, and then leadership and teamwork. Because the evidence base for the importance of these skills is really clear. We have strong evidence that these skills help to increase resilience and self-belief and adaptability. We know that it boosts confidence in using AI and new technologies. We know it reduces the likelihood of being unemployed in later life. And there's also a good evidence that these skills help to boost lifetime earnings and job and life satisfaction. So with all these benefits, why would we not want this to be a core part of education? However, there's also a real challenge in the delivery. So I think there's a growing consensus around the world, and I know Colombia has been a real leading country in much of this work to make sure that these types of skills and broader social and emotional learning are seen as an important part of education. The majority of countries now include some aspects of social and emotional learning as being outcomes that they expect to see from education. However, what we've seen at the same time is that there's still a real challenge about how do you ensure that the aspiration to build these skills for every learner actually turns into changes at a classroom level which support the development of those skills for individual learners. And I think some of the things which are sometimes missing and which make that really difficult are things like having those shared definitions of what essential skills and development steps look like, about having teachers who are confident to teach those skills, around having a curriculum and teaching resources easily available. I think there's challenges if there's not assessment models that measure these skills. And I think it's really important to have clear expectations of what learners should be able to do in these skills at every age and stage of learning. And so our work is all about how do we try to overcome some of those challenges. And so the heart of our model is something called the Skills Builder Universal Framework. So this has been the result of 8 years of research and development and testing in order to try to take those skills and make them as teachable and measurable as any other outcome. And this model is all open source, so it's freely available for everybody to use, and it can be accessed easily through our website. And I'm just putting the link in the chat there as well if anybody wants to have a look. The approach is a simple one, which is to take these 8 skills that we started with, but then what we found is that those skills by themselves are far too big for an educator to know where to begin. And so what we've invested a lot of time and energy into is taking those big skills and actually breaking them down into smaller steps. So each of the 8 skills we then break down into 16 steps, and these become much more manageable for an educator to teach or to assess. So if we take the example of listening, for example, some of the simplest things in listening, which you might imagine for children just starting school, are things like being able to focus by listening for a short period of time. When they're able to do that, they might move on to recalling, so being able to remember simple instructions. They might then move on to step 3, which is checking their understanding if they don't understand something. And so you see, rather than trying to teach listening as a whole big concept, what it allows the educator to do is to focus much more closely on what the next logical thing is for that learner to learn. And putting those steps in order has been a really important part of that development process and something that we've spent a lot of time testing, because actually it there really helps to structure what progression looks like. Underneath each of these skill steps, what you can then do is really break down what the core underpinning knowledge is that a learner needs, but also help teachers to understand how they would assess whether that had been achieved. And then finally, what we also provide, again, completely for free, is a lot of adaptable resources which teachers can use in order to break down and build those skills. And so just to take that detail a little bit further, so again, if we start with all of those 8 skills, and then this is the 16 steps that make up listening. And again, we start at the very beginning with the youngest learners learning how to focus and recall. But as you can see, there are lots of steps to being a master of listening. Some of the more intermediate ones include things like being able to take notes when listening, being able to show active listening, being able to ask open questions. There are important steps in here as well around identifying influence. So being able to spot when somebody is trying to influence them, or be able to identify bias, and then being able to evaluate different perspectives. And as I said, what then sits beneath each of these different ideas is both what those things mean, why and when that step is important, how to do it, and then for a teacher, how they could assess it, which can include reflective questions. So being able to test that underpinning knowledge, being able to see what you observe. So can you observe the learner putting this step into action? And then finally, you can also gather evidence of how that step has been used in real life. And we're really keen that this is something which is freely available to anybody who it's useful to. And so we've worked very hard to firstly make sure that it's relevant and that it doesn't have anything in it which is not useful or which is a repeat of other concepts. Second thing we've worked really hard at is to make sure it's complete. So we worked as we refined the framework to look at wherever there were references to these skills in curricula around the world. And we tried to make sure that any time there were mentions of transferable skills, that we'd pick those up and that we made sure that our framework covered any of those types of mentions. We tried to make it as simple as possible to use it so that those individual steps can be easily taught, and then tried to make it easy to navigate. So to find the right way to go from where a learner is today and then what the next step of progress looks for them. And I think this is also really important, which is as we were reviewing the framework last year, we used it as an opportunity to spot, firstly, are people moving through the steps in sequence? Because what you'd expect is as a step gets harder, you have fewer people who are able to demonstrate that step. So that's all about are the steps in the right sequence? And we also looked at are there any outliers? So are there any steps which don't fit the pattern? And so we were able to use that insight and that data to help make sure the framework was as effective as possible. We've also tried to learn, as I said, from international frameworks. So looking at matching between other existing curricula, other existing models to make sure that we were national best practice. And then what that allowed us to do was to try to make sure that our framework was as complete and relevant as possible, while having as little duplication as it possibly could. And here's just some examples of some of the other international frameworks that we were able to learn from and to be able to help make sure we were improving our model as much as possible. And then finally, what we've been able to do with this model as we've developed it over the 8 years is actually apply it to lots of different jobs to understand the skills requirements when it comes to transferable skills of different jobs and be able to test whether, um, whether these skills apply and what skill levels people are working at across the whole population as well. So that's the framework. And as I said, that's sort of open source. It's available to anyone that it's useful to. But actually, what we're also keen to do is to support that widespread use, right? Because it's one thing to have something that anybody can use, but it's another thing to actually support the implementation of it. Because ultimately, what we think is that, as I said at the beginning, that building essential skills should be a normal part of a good education all the way through school. So all the way from preschool through primary and secondary school, supported by learning and sports and arts and other activities outside of school, and then through college and beyond. So actually, we work with quite a lot of employers and businesses who use this framework to support their own staff to develop their skills as well. And so the work that we do at Skills Builder Global Initiative is around supporting schools and NGOs and indeed whole education systems to use that universal framework model to support educators to build the essential skills of their learners in a way that we see as measurable and scalable and robust. And what we've been able to demonstrate is that by having that sort of structured approach, it's possible to really accelerate the rate at which learners are building those skills. So for each of the last 5 years, we've run an evaluation which compares learners who have not taken part in one of our programs with learners who have. And that's why it's been possible to demonstrate that all learners can make accelerated progress, and it's possible to make accelerated progress across all of those different skills. Uh, and one of the things that we're really excited about now is that although the universal framework started in the UK, it's quickly been informed by working with fantastic organizations around the world. And so we've been able to work with lots of schools and schools groups to help them implement the model. We've worked with NGOs around the world to use a universal framework in their programs. And then finally, we've also been working with governments on system strengthening by using the universal framework in their own curriculums in currently 5 countries, so the UK, the Czech Republic, Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda. And I think what we're really excited about is working increasingly in partnership with Coast School in Colombia to be exploring how we can adapt and translate the universal framework so it's an available tool for organizations in Colombia. And just to give you a sense of what it looks like for those different partners, when we're working with schools and colleges, it's all about thinking about how can a school or college develop a comprehensive and sustainable strategy for building essential skills in their school. Because ultimately, we want the school to own that strategy and for it to be something that they are leading, and not in the end needing us to support them with it every day. That means that we need to have a skills leader in the school who is taking the lead on using the framework across school life. It means that we also need teachers who feel trained and supported. And then finally, what we do is we recognize that great practice with a Skills Builder Award. And that helps to both to reflect the energy the school has put in, but importantly, to build out these examples which can be used to help bring to life what success looks like in using the framework. And excitingly, with CoSchool, we're just in the stage of recruiting a first sort of pilot cohort in Colombia to try out the model, and so that we can learn and think about how we can adapt it further for the future as well. The second way we work is with existing NGOs. So sometimes partners have programs where actually using that universal framework can help them to be more deliberate about how essential skills are being built. It can also help with measuring skill progress, which can be very helpful as well. And actually, we then recognize again those sort of really high quality programs with what we call an impact level, which helps to again showcase and spotlight really amazing programs around the world. And we're really pleased that we are able to offer a number of fully funded places for organizations in Colombia over the coming year, which on our program, which is called the Global Impact Fellowship, which again will support organizations who want to explore how this model could support their work. And then finally, in the end, what we really love is when every learner has the opportunity to build essential skills. And so where we've worked with governments or school systems, we thought about how can this framework be built into the national education curriculum? How can we implement effective assessment of essential skills so that that progress is measured and valued? And then how do we train educators at scale so that educators feel confident to build these skills? And what we really want to do is to also make sure that good practice is recognised at that school inspection level, so that schools are supported and recognised for their progress in building these skills for their learners. So I hope that's been a useful insight into the work that we've been doing. Hopefully, it sparked some ideas or some thoughts or some questions. But I'm going to pause there. I'm really happy to continue to continue the conversation and answer any questions that you've got. But thank you very much again for having me. Really appreciate it.
Tom, muchas gracias por este compartir. En realidad nos dejas unas preguntas muy interesantes porque aquí hoy estamos hablando de unos nuevos lineamientos curriculares que el Ministerio de Educación de Colombia ha expedido y que necesitamos comprender, contextualizar y tener elementos para aportar a las comunidades en la apropiación de estos lineamientos. Las 8 habilidades que tú nos presentas están en relación con estas competencias que el Ministerio de Educación propone y nos han explicado que todo este proceso se enmarca en una gran apuesta de posicionamiento de lo que significa la formación integral para los niños, las niñas y los adolescentes. Y cómo dentro de este compromiso de promover la formación integral para asegurar que los niños y las niñas tienen las fortalezas y las condiciones para participar, para ejercer la ciudadanía en el contexto donde habitan, pues esto que tú nos presentas es un recurso fundamental que también nos lleva a pensar qué es el currículo, entender en realidad en las instituciones educativas cómo desarrollamos, cómo comprendemos el currículo y cómo desarrollamos las acciones para ser coherente con este proceso. Entonces, gracias por mostrarnos pues esta construcción. Es una muy buena noticia que esté abierto y que podamos seguir conociendo, profundizando y relacionando el código de conversación que tenemos hoy a partir de lo que el Ministerio de Educación recientemente presenta al país y cómo las intervenciones y los enfoques de trabajo que estamos orientando hoy desde las distintas organizaciones que hacen parte de APSEC, pues pueden tener una sintonía, una identidad con este marco que tiene una validez sustentada pues ya en la puesta en marcha y en el aporte que ha representado para tantas comunidades y para tantos actores. Así que nos dejas una tarea importante y es relacionar estas 8 habilidades con este código de conversación que tenemos hoy en el país. Muchas gracias, Tom. Tenemos un espacio para preguntas, por supuesto, las personas que quieran compartir preguntas, compartir desde el trabajo que hacen, qué posibilidades ven, qué ideas suscita escuchar esta experiencia de Tom. Por favor, veo en el chat. Bueno, Dana nos pregunta y bienvenidos a todas las demás personas que quieran hacer aporte. Dana dice, yo quiero saber cómo han logrado ustedes que la medición del progreso en habilidades esenciales sea percibida por docentes y tomadores de decisiones no como una carga adicional de evaluación, sino como una herramienta útil para mejorar el aprendizaje y el bienestar de los estudiantes. Es decir, que la pregunta de Ana va muy en relación con esto que decíamos ahora y es, Tom, todavía en nuestro contexto, a pesar de que tenemos un marco normativo, a pesar de que hay iniciativas importantes que han logrado un trabajo de motivación con los directivos, docentes, orientadores escolares, parece que seguimos centrados en lo académico, en lo cognitivo, ¿sí? Y que hablar de lo socioemocional representa entender que hay una tarea adicional, que hay un trabajo para el cual no estamos preparados, que nos pone una carga adicional. Entonces, en el marco de eso que tú nos presentas, con esa comprensión de lo que es eh, un proceso continuo para marcar una trayectoria, Dana nos pregunta cómo han hecho ustedes para lograr que estas habilidades sean esenciales, estas habilidades esenciales, perdón, sean percibidas como un proceso que se integra y no que representa una carga adicional.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think it's that's always the first challenge, isn't it? Is how do you make time in a busy curriculum when teachers and educators are very busy already? And how do you get this to be seen as something that's important in its own right? So first off, I think in terms of methods for assessment, I think we found that you need a combination often to understand these skills properly. And I think that's also true of almost any skill, is that you need to understand, does the individual have the underlying knowledge of the skill that would suggest that they could do it? Then secondly, do you actually observe that skill when they're doing an activity that could use it? And then thirdly, is there evidence over time that they've been able to practice and apply this skill in lots of different contexts? And so that combination of underlying knowledge, observation in practice, and then evidence building is, I think, how we build the most robust way of assessing these skills. And sometimes, certainly in the UK, perhaps not in Colombia, but in the UK, we still have the very boring conversation about can you even measure skills? To which I would always argue we're happy to measure whether people have driving skills before we give them a driving license. We're happy to measure if doctors have skills before we let them operate on people. We're very happy to measure pilot skills before they fly an airplane. So if we feel like we can measure those skills, then absolutely we can measure these skills. Um, but all of those use the same method, right? You always test somebody's underlying knowledge. You observe can they actually use the skill in real life, and you ask them to build up a portfolio of evidence over time that they've been able to do that. So I think that's sort of one part of it is that we can have a serious approach to measuring skills. But I know that doesn't answer the second part, which is how do you do that in a context where there's lots of other things going on? So what we found is that there are some shortcuts which can help teachers to make this more manageable. I think one is using formative learner self-reflection as a tool to get some insight as to how learners perceive their own skill steps and using that as a way to focus on where the gaps are, but also to see whether learners themselves feel like they're making measurable progress. And that is something which is much more manageable because it doesn't require the teacher to be making those assessments of everybody. We've seen some increasingly clever tools which allow teachers to do real-time observations of learners. So rather than it being a separate event, it can be that they record in real time when they're spotting a learner using one of those steps. So again, it helps to mean that this isn't a big other thing that's happening. It's something which they're able to do as they go along. And we've also seen people using those portfolios as ways of gathering evidence over a year. And again, that doesn't have to be so time consuming. So I think there are some good routes, and I think there are some ways of doing that aren't too burdensome. I think at a national level in the UK, the universal framework is being used by this year. They're using 500,000 learners, and they're measuring their progress at different times every 2 years through secondary school, and using that as a way of measuring whether learners are on track to achieve the level of skills that they need when they finish school. So that was a very long answer, but I hope that's helpful just for framing that I think we can do assessment really well. I think it is possible to find shortcuts that make it easier for teachers. In the end, there are important national ways for this data to be taken seriously as well. Thank you so much for such a good question.
Gracias, Tom. En realidad pienso que eso que mencionas es un aspecto que necesitamos clarificar en nuestro contexto. Y es cuál es, primero, la intencionalidad de todo este proceso y luego la integración efectiva, porque todavía no está así. Entonces, hoy los maestros tienen unas planificaciones en las instituciones educativas, pero este componente de trabajo no hace parte todavía de ese proceso y por eso lo siguen sintiendo al margen. Pienso que lo que tú estás diciendo es que si facilitamos esa integración, el profesor no tiene que sentir que es algo adicional, sino que está incorporado y hace parte de su dinámica diaria, ¿sí? Ahí está nuestro reto, como cultura, como organización institucional y también como un abordaje distinto de lo que significa hoy enseñar y aprender, ¿cierto? Y cuáles son los compromisos, las responsabilidades que tenemos en los procesos de enseñanza y aprendizaje para los niños y las niñas. Muchas gracias, Tom. ¿Alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta? ¿Quiere comentar cómo ve esto desde la experiencia que realizan en su organización? ¿Alguien más quiere preguntar cómo llegaron, por ejemplo, a esas 8 habilidades? ¿Alguien tiene algo que anotar, por favor? Yo le pregunto eso a Tom, cómo después de abordar los diferentes marcos que existen con todo este boom que ha generado el tema de la educación socioemocional, cómo concretar, cómo llegaron a la concreción de esas 8 habilidades.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the challenge in this space is that there's so many different ways of capturing very similar ideas. And I think sometimes we've certainly in a UK context, we've spent an awful time debating what we should call different skills. And everyone has their own favorite language and their own particular way of trying to describe them. But what we were finding was that in the end, the same four big concepts came up over and over again as being transferable skills. So everyone talked about communication skills. Everyone talked about collaboration skills, so being able to work effectively with other people. Creativity and problem solving always came up. And then self-management and resilience always came up. And so in the end, because there were these four big themes, we thought each of those four themes has two aspects. So for communication, listening or speaking, for leadership and teamwork, whether you're the person in charge or whether you're somebody who's contributing, um, for planning and adapting, obviously, there's two parts that go together. Um, and then for creativity or creating more options and then problem solving about how do you structure finding the very best of those options. So actually we found that that felt a very natural balance. And we felt that fewer skills than that and you lost some important detail and nuance. And if there were more skills than that, then actually it became impossible for teachers to remember them all. And I think one of the things that we have worked at really hard is thinking all the time from an educator perspective. So what's actually realistic for an educator to be doing in a classroom when there's so much else going on, when there's so many other things for them to be thinking about? what's realistic for a learner to remember when again they have so many other things going on. And we found that this felt like, although there might have been other ways of defining these skills, that felt like the right balance between detail and covering everything that we wanted to cover.
Tom, gracias. Qué elemento tan importante ese para nosotros. Fíjate que somos una sociedad que tiene una cultura que pienso que es ambiciosa y le cuesta concretar, acotar, ¿sí? Entonces, eso que tú nos estás diciendo es muy valioso, que sea realista pensando en la relación profesor-estudiante. Y es verdad, hay distintos compromisos en el aula, el tiempo se pasa muy rápido en el cronograma escolar, entonces es necesario pensar que sea un número prudente, manejable y, y posible de integrar dentro del conjunto de las actividades que desarrollan en la institución educativa. Me quedo con eso, de verdad me parece muy valioso y es, siempre queremos más, pero se nos olvida qué es lo posible en los tiempos y en la dinámica de las interacciones que se tienen. Entonces pienso, por ejemplo, Tom, que en las instituciones públicas de las que nos hablaba Camila hace un momento, nosotros tenemos un profesor con 40, 45 estudiantes, a veces 50 estudiantes. Es un número significativo, ¿cierto? Para facilitar la interacción. Si además a ese profesor le ponemos una cantidad de asuntos que se le dificulta nombrar, solo nombrar, imagínate lo que será entender cómo se evidencia esto en su práctica. Entonces, muchas gracias por esto que nos dices. Bueno, ¿alguien más tiene preguntas? Hoy este equipo de participantes ha estado silencioso, no sé si tiene que ver con que la mañana está un poco fría, pero quiero saber si hay alguna otra intervención, pregunta, comentario, idea, sugerencia que nos quieran señalar, por favor. No siempre tenemos la suerte de estar con Tom en vivo y en directo para hacer las preguntas. Seguramente vamos a poder consultar y revisar esto y es muy importante verlo desde el lugar que cada uno está pensando sus intervenciones, teniendo la evidencia de sus prácticas, hacer las preguntas desde ahí. ¿Alguien quiere anotar algo, por favor?
Yo sí quisiera preguntar algo. Ahorita con
Adelante,
respecto a lo
Camila.
que te contaba de lo que trabajamos en la fundación, pues me es algo muy familiar de lo que decía Tom, como las habilidades. Nosotros en esos tres factores de éxito, pues les enseñamos a los niños cómo a reconocer eso que tiene, con eso que nació, con ese talento que ya tiene. Y pues es importante que ellos también reconozcan que hay otras habilidades que se pueden desarrollar con el tiempo, que no es solamente que yo nací bueno para dibujar y ya con eso me voy a quedar toda la vida, sino que es importante conocer qué más puedo hacer y desarrollar para poder dejar esa huella en el mundo, ¿cierto? Eso es nosotros trabajamos las habilidades de los chicos y también es importante que ellos reconozcan sus emociones para que puedan aportar al mundo que nosotros queremos dejar. Entonces me parece muy chévere y llamativo esto. Lo voy a consultar en la fundación que se pueda, no sé si se pueda de pronto trabajar con Tom, lo que trabajamos nosotros en la fundación y se pueda también trabajar lo que dijo Tom, que me pareció muy llamativo. Muchas gracias.
Sí,
Thank
Camila,
you
qué
so much.
interesante, porque hace relación a ser agentes en realidad, transformadores, ¿cierto? Y bueno, no sé, Tom, si quieres anotar algo ahí. Camila nos dice algo muy especial teniendo en cuenta las características de la población. Promover el reconocimiento de sus fortalezas, identificar sus talentos, sus intereses, sus motivaciones y desde ahí promover que los niños, las niñas y los adolescentes estén motivados para generar transformaciones, para hacer aportes que modifiquen también las condiciones de vida, ¿cierto? Y entonces no se piensa solo en lógica individual, sino también construcción colectiva. No sé, Tom, desde la experiencia que tú tienes en el conjunto de estas habilidades, yo veo allí la relevancia, por ejemplo, de el sentido de la comunicación, escuchar y hablar, aprender a liderar, trabajar en equipo, resolver problemas juntos. Ahí está en juego permanentemente todo esto para lograr que en realidad cada persona se pueda reconocer a sí misma, sentirse agente, transformador y evidenciar estos cambios que se proponen.
Yeah, I think that's right. What I really liked as well about what you were saying, Camilla, is that of course everybody has different strengths, and that's wonderful. And we want to celebrate and encourage that, and we want people to realize and make the most of their strengths. I think one of the things that I also think is very important, which is exactly what you said, is that part of the importance of this framework isn't to point out to people the things that they can't do yet. It's to say, look, this is where you are already, and look, this is how you could get even better. And it's that really important positive messaging, which is actually, it's not a mystery how to get better at something. And we can take away that mystery and help people to see I'm here today, but I know that if I keep working at it, I could get there and there and there and keep progressing in the future. And that's why we talk about steps, is because we think about it as taking steps in a journey in order to keep progressing. So I really appreciated your comments, and I'd be very glad to follow up afterwards if there's anything that useful that we can share with you in your foundation as well.
Muchas
Bueno, muchas
gracias, Tom.
gracias. Ya tenemos entonces posibilidad de visita de Tom a tu fundación y a toda la región aquí de Bogotá y Cundinamarca, Camila. Donde
Sería
podemos
muy
estar en
chévere y
contacto.
agradable recibirte aquí en nuestro municipio con los brazos abiertos como lo sabemos hacer.
Gracias. Gracias, Camila. Gracias, Tom. Bueno, pues muchas gracias también, Catalina. Creo que vamos cerrando eh, la conversación con Tom, porque pues tenemos unos tiempos específicos. Entonces, muchas gracias, Tom. Un abrazo. Seguramente te estaremos consultando, porque en realidad en Colombia estamos en un momento particular de comprensión de esta oportunidad que tenemos y también de fortalecimiento de nuestras aproximaciones, de nuestras dinámicas de intervención para ser más asertivos y en realidad contribuir a la transformación de estos esquemas rígidos y tradicionales que tenemos en nuestra gestión educativa. Entonces, un abrazo desde Colombia, Tom. Muchas gracias y seguro que sí te vamos a consultar y vamos a hacer un ejercicio detallado de la comprensión de este marco y de la identificación de oportunidades para nuestro contexto. Muchas gracias. Bueno, creo que continuamos entonces, Dana, con nuestra presentación. Y la idea es que podamos, a través de este código QR, recuerden, tuvimos dos, uno para registrar la asistencia, que nos interesa saber con nombre propio, con quién podemos seguir estableciendo las comunicaciones, y también a través de este código, que por favor nos compartan qué aprendizajes se llevan hoy, qué reflexiones, qué preguntas, qué ideas surgen a partir de esto que nos compartió Tom en el día de hoy. Les invitamos a consultar, a profundizar en esta información que Tom nos deja, que claro, tiene un contexto diferente, pero que desde la experiencia, la práctica y toda esta cualificación que se ha venido haciendo, porque fíjense que él habla de unos pasos, de un proceso. Asimismo, nosotros en nuestro contexto tenemos que hacer ese ejercicio, en dónde estamos, qué tenemos, cuáles son nuestras fortalezas, qué podemos tomar, cómo podemos poner en contexto esta nueva construcción que estamos convocados en este momento para seguir desarrollando este proceso y que tenga vida, sostenibilidad y proyecciones.